possessory interest, those can be arranged and negotiated or put in a contract or deed between private owners. But sometimes also government is the owner of the property. So that's a slightly different story and may apply different regulations and rules because government is the big guy. They put in the law and regulations to control and restrict the use of land. Okay, so the role of government overall is to affect the cost and supply of real estate. By what means? One is zoning, okay, zoning codes. So and other land regulations like stamp duties, okay, fees on new land development, and also building codes. Okay, and so these are all restrictions imposed by the government. The government can also affect rental rate. Rental rates in user markets through property tax. So let's say if you are a property owner and government usually set up a rate to ask you to pay property tax. Let's say if the government put down 2% of the rate versus 10% of the rate, it will affect property owners' cost of holding that property. Okay, so this is what it means, affect rental rates in use markets through property tax. And the last one, we have talked a lot about government provision to roads, provision of roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, healthcare, or these public facilities for the general public. Okay. Here we are gonna focus on. So there are different ways for public of government control over private property, and we will be focusing on this zoning and eminent domain. Zoning is usually controlled by the planning department to set up restrictions on the type of land use, okay, and restrictions on FAR, floor area ratio, restrictions on the height of the building, okay, restrictions on the density of the building. So these are the zoning. And on eminent domain, which means is the right for government to take over private property without the owner's consent. Okay, so it means use government power to retrieve private land, even the private landowner refuse to sell it. So there is a way to do that. But of course, the government should not abuse its power to take over private property. It has to follow a certain procedure, and by following the certain procedure, the way to take over private land is called eminent domain. Okay. Here, what is zoning? This is a very important term for land use planning. Okay. It's the term you have to know. Land use planning. It's the regulation on buildings. And the goal of a zoning is to minimize the disruptive land use, to make sure that land use is compatible for public, for the general public. And it is a legislative process. So that means it's written as a statutory requirement for most of the cities, okay? And what you see is, we've seen it last week, is the colorful map, okay? And with a lot of different colors. Each color implies one type of land use. Usually it's a multicolored map. Okay, this is some examples of zoning maps in other cities. So as you can see, it has numbers for each parcel, and of course colored, and each square has a number. So each number is, if you look at the legend here, is one type of use. For example, R1A is one family residential district. So that means that means one RA is, you know, how high your building can be, okay, and how dense you can build buildings next to each other. Okay. And this is a zoning map of Boston. And this is a larger scale, cover a larger area. And usually when this is a bigger scale, but if you zoom in to a smaller scale, and you cannot read it here, but actually the information here is about building height for each corresponding parcel, for each corresponding area or district, okay? And also FAR. So these are the very two key important information usually will be shown on the zoning map here. But attached to this zoning map is also some explanatory documents, statements. So you will have text and with maps attached. So that's the zoning ordinance, zoning code. Okay. So if we have zoning, if a property falls in a certain zone, okay, let's say one family residential zone, but if you think, okay, as the population expand in that district, and we really need to build higher buildings in that area, okay, not a particular parcel, but in the overall area in that district, we need higher density buildings. What you have to do is you need a rezoning. So this is also a legal procedure for developers or for landowners to go through, that to the planning department, you have to request a rezoning of the parcel and the district. Okay, it's amendment to the ordinance map to change the use district of individual parcel. So once this individual parcel is rezoned for, let's say, multi-family residential area, that means increase the density of that area, it should apply to the whole area. Okay. Another term related to the change of zoning is zoning variance. Zoning variance is different from rezoning. Okay. Zoning variance is just an exception the planning department gives out or approved to a particular parcel. That's zoning variance. So you are making a variance. You are requesting for variance for that particular parcel. Okay, it's an exception. So the overall zoning of the whole district doesn't change. What changed is only the particular parcel. I gave you an exception. For example, Kai Tak Airport. Okay, let's say the airport is still there, and there is a restriction of height of buildings around the airport, right? So near the airport, you shouldn't build high buildings. And CDU is at the edge of that height restrictions, that area. And CDU thinks, you know, because of these certain geographical conditions, some characteristics, it's actually okay to build higher buildings. But the zoning doesn't allow CDU to build buildings above 5 floors, 5 stories. Okay. What CDU can do is to get a zoning variance. CDU cannot get a rezoning of the parcel because there is a high restriction near airport, and CDU falls into the boundary of the zone. Okay. So, and then the planning department, okay, so considering all these conditions, it looks like you can build maybe 6 stories building. Okay, so that actually violates the zoning code, right? But CDU got an exception of building 6-story buildings. That's a zoning variance. And this is an exception, and it's likely also temporary. So if CDU transfer the ownership of that building to a different party, and that party wants to rebuild, demolish the 6th-floor building and rebuild a new building, then likely it has to get permission from the planning department again. Okay. But it depends on the situation, local regulations. Okay. Eminent domain. This will affect you if one day your property, if you are approached by the government saying that we are going to redevelop your area, so please sell your property to the government. And you will have to negotiate with the government about what kind of compensation you can receive from them by selling the property. And if you refuse to sell it, but all of your neighbors and everybody else in your building agree to sell it to the government, and you are the only holdout household in this whole building transactions, then government can take your property by eminent domain. Okay? But there are, of course, some conditions for government to use this power. Is that the property needed is for public use. Okay? So if the government take your property for commercial development, for profit-making construction, then they don't have the right to take over your property if you refuse to sell. Okay? It has to be for public use. For example, it can be for public use, let's say, for public housing. It's for public use, for the general public housing construction. It may work, okay? And for park, for open space, for public use, it works. The condemner, so it's let's say the government, is not acting out of malice to deprive the owner of the land. So the government should release the full information of the situation. And if the government deceive you, oh, all of your neighbors sell it at this certain price, then I should take over at this price of your property. Then if it's trying to deceive you with any evidence, then you can sue the government. The eminent domain method doesn't work. Okay? And the last thing is the compensation. It has to be market price. It has to be just compensation. It has to be a fair price to get your land, even you refuse to sell. Okay. So there are two issues in the use of eminent domain. One issue is, how do you justify public use? You know, it's easy to understand, okay, for road construction, for highway, that's public use, for parks, that's public use. What about for, let's say, for public housing? I think it's also tricky, public housing. Because public housing construction is for a certain group of people, it's not for the general public. So it's tricky to decide whether the purpose of that purchase is purely public use. Okay? Oh, here, I have the example here. Okay? Buildings and military camps, hospitals, highways, public open space. So these can be easy to identify as public uses. Okay? All right. Another issue related to eminent domain is just compensation. So it's the compensation, the value of the compensation should be based on value. And value can be market value, and it can be below market value. Because think about, you live in a building that's very run down, already 50 years old building, and the government decide to pay you a market price of that rundown building. Would you accept it? Do you think it's a just compensation? That is the argument you have to make. Because at that location, the old building, the rundown building, the location is very good. And the market price of a new building in that area is very high. But because you live in an old building, and the compensation is far below the market price of a new building, of course, as the property owner, you won't agree. You won't accept that compensated amount offered by the government. So you will have to justify the value of the current value of your old building. Okay. All right, so this is the end of the lecture, and I'm gonna ask my TA to cover a little bit some of the financial terms, and we